Shalom and welcome to the One Pasuk podcast, where the rabbis at Congregation Avas Torah each share an insight on one particular pasuk from the parsha and reflect on each other's ideas. Rabbinic banter, I like to call it. I am Chaim Pupko, and I am joined by my dear friends and teammates, Rabbi Daniel Goldberg,
Shalom,
and Rabbi Morty Jesus.
Shalom.
If you'd like to sponsor an upcoming episode, please contact the shul. All right, here we go. Our One Pasuk for this week's episode of the One Pasuk podcast, it comes from the very beginning of Parshas Devarim, which kicks off Sefer Devarim. The very first Pasuk, Perak Aleph, Pasuk Aleph, Eile hadvarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael be'ever hayarden. These are the words that Moshe addressed to all Israel on the other side of the Jordan, Bamidbar, Arabah, Suph, Paran and Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, Di-zahab, through the wilderness in the Arabah, near Suph, between Paran and Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, Di-zahab, all these locations, not clear what they are, but what we have here is the beginning of Moshe's final address to Bnei Israel, the long soliloquy that comprises the lion's share of the book of Devarim. Moshe is addressing the people, of course, on the banks of the Jordan River, plains of Moab, where they are ready to go into the land of Canaan and begin the conquest of the land promised to them by Hashem.
The book of Devarim is Moshe's valedictory address to Bnei Israel. It's his last will and testament, if you will, where Moshe Rabbeinu understands that he's not going to have the opportunity to take the Jewish people into the land of Israel, and therefore he intends to send them off with specific messages that can strengthen them to ensure that when they do arrive in the land of Israel, they'll be able to succeed. Now, the Mefarshim point out that that very first pasuk lists very many locations. As Rabbi Pupko alluded to, it's not clear precisely what the purpose of mentioning all these places are. But I'd also like to touch on that. But right before that, I'd like to also point out that the words are Ele HaDevarim. Devarim, Dibur, Davar, something of that nature, Vaidaber. Anytime we see that shoresh, it's harsh language. Moshe is giving either musar or bringing a command, a very specific command that cannot be negotiated. And those are the times we see Vaidaber Hashem el Moshe or Ele HaDevarim. But yet, what I found so fascinating is that the reason why it uses the term Devarim is because Moshe is now going to give very strong rebuke to Bnei Israel. And he's going to highlight sins that they committed throughout their sojourn in the desert and explain to them that these are some of the pitfalls that you faced. Recognize that when you go into the land of Israel, ensure that you're not going to make these very same mistakes. But yet, Moshe, the consummate leader that he is, in an attempt to give musar to Bnei Israel, Rashi says every one of these locations are areas in which they sinned. Different cities, different stops along their journey in the Midbar where they sinned. And Moshe goes out of his way to give veiled rebuke because he understands that as much as I have to give Devarim, harsh words of rebuke, at the same time, I love these people so much. I don't want to put it in their face. And so Moshe says, I'm going to allude to it by just reminding Bnei Israel of these locations in which these sins took place. Here you see this beautiful balance of where Moshe is forced to give Ele HaDevarim, strong words of rebuke, but yet at the same time, he refuses to embarrass them in the process. And this is a lesson, obviously, that we can all take to heart. There are times where we're forced to educate our children or speak to a neighbor or explain something to somebody about, even if it's not necessarily words of rebuke, but explain something to someone that is uncomfortable. We have the option to just stick it in their face, use Devarim, use harsh words, or we can give veiled references to those locations as to not embarrass those people. And Moshe strikes that balance beautifully with that sensitivity.
It's interesting you mentioned that topic because I was thinking about the mitzvah of Tochacha recently and how it's a mitzvah that seems to have fallen out of practice. I think many people would say, am I really worthy to rebuke somebody else? And I think many of us, especially in Western societies, sort of blanch at being criticized. Who are you to tell me what to do? This is between me and Hashem. And it's just so interesting to me. Hocheach tochiach es am yisecha is a mitzvah on the book.
Tochacha is considered to be one of the most difficult. I think the Sfat Emet actually writes it's one of the most difficult mitzvot to actually give. But I do believe that the same way it's a mitzvah to give musar and rebuke to somebody who's going to listen, and it's your obligation to do so, it's also true that if you know they're not going to listen, you should not be giving it to them.
Right.
So it's always really understanding the parties. Obviously, if you have true unconditional love for that other person, naturally you have less to be concerned that those words are not going to go over well because you're in it for their interest. It's not about you telling them.
Yeah.
It's not about you telling them this is something you can't do and how dare you and what are you thinking, but from a place of love.
Plus, there is a distinction between what Moshe is doing, which is addressing the entire people, versus rebuking somebody one.
Yep.
But addressing the entire people, there's always that. I remember Rabbi Golden telling me this, that anytime he gave a really critical drasha, one that had a real strong message of rebuke, the response usually is, "Oh, Rabbi, you really told that guy.
Mm-hmm.
You really told him, right? You address a large crowd. Many people feel like, oh, yeah, those guys, they got an issue."
Yeah, and rebuke, when done properly, it really is a sign of love, because I like to use the example of, if a stranger on the subway has spinach in their teeth, I'm not going to tell them because I don't have a relationship with them. But if a loved one had spinach in their teeth, even though it might be awkward to say, by the way,
right.
But I would do it because it's worth my discomfort in that moment to help them, to spare them from that embarrassment. So when you see someone with a kind of self-destructive behavior, if I have no relationship with them, it's just an uncomfortable conversation. But if there is a relationship, then I'm willing to put myself out there to have that conversation and to help them with an intervention, and that comes from a place of love. All right, let's get us back to our pasuk. As Rabbi Kisus noted, and you, Rabbi, noted in your introduction, there's this huge surplus of geographic coordinates in this first pasuk. The Medrash that you described, Rabbi Kisus, understands the surplus of language as having a kind of subtle layer to it, referencing Jewish history and these moments of sin. But, if we kind of take a step back, and I'd like to offer a kind of a more global analysis, a 30,000-foot analysis by way of Rav Yehuda Amital, who was a founding Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion. He saw in this pasuk, and really the few psukim that follow. So if the first pasuk has all this excessive language around the exact geographic coordinates, so in the psukim that follow, there's a lot of detail about where we are in time. Exactly how many days from this place and how far from Chorev, and a lot of, so we know exactly precisely where we are. And he extrapolated from that something so powerful, the idea that the Torah is a document that is relevant to every place and every time. But a person has to understand what place and time they are in. If you want to extrapolate the relevance of the Torah, of course the Torah is unchanging and halacha is unchanging, but in terms of its message for this moment, if you want to really understand how it is speaking to this particular moment, you need to understand the moment. You need to understand exactly where you are, exactly when you are. And if you have that awareness, then you can pull out the Torah's message for this exact moment. And so it's giving us all these coordinates to almost frame Moshe's speech to tell us that he's speaking precisely to this moment. And I also think that that's just a kind of a lens through which to understand the whole Sefer, because we know that there's a lot in Sefer Devarim that is repeating what came beforehand, but often it has a little bit of a different focus, a little bit of a different angle. For halachic matters, sometimes it introduces new dimensions to a halacha. From a narrative, sometimes it'll give us something that seems to almost conflict with the way that the narrative was told in Bamidbar, for example, or in Shmos, or to just a whole new layer to it. And the point is that if you want to understand the Sefer and understand how we navigate what seems to be contradiction, it's not contradiction. It's that Moshe is speaking to a particular set of people at a particular place at a particular time, and he has a certain interest in what he wants to highlight and focus on to bring it to life and to make it relevant and matter to these people in this exact time and place. And so these opening psukim are teeing that up for us to appreciate how to read this Sefer in its exactly correct context. And I think that that's a very powerful tool for understanding Devarim, and also just the Rav Amital's broader point that in life, if you understand the moment, you really understand the where you are in history and exactly where you are geographically and time, you can pull out the way in which the Torah is speaking exactly to this moment.
It reminds me of our Torah I saw once about the Chatzotzros, that all of the kalim that were made for the Mishkan were meant to be used in perpetuity, except for the chatzotzros. It says, Aseh lecha, that you, Moshe, you have to make chatzotzros.
The trumpets.
The trumpets, thank you. And these trumpets, these chatzotzros, the reason it says lecha, you, Moshe, is because the chatzotzros that Moshe uses aren't going to be the chatzotzros that the next generation uses. And each generation has to make their own chatzotzros. Because the chatzotzros, the trumpets, are meant to call the people, to speak to the people. And each generation needs to be spoken to in its own language. That's what it symbolizes. It's a very similar idea.
That's a very beautiful idea.
One of my favorite borts right there, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Actually, if you were in the Ben Roy Sephardic Center, you heard that one.
Yeah?
Just a couple weeks ago.
Oh, look at that.
Yep. It actually had to be made out of Moshe Rabbeinu's own finance. He had to purchase with his own money. Aseh lecha, the Gemara learns, is lecha mi shelcha. It has to be from your own money.
Right.
And they ask, well, everything else was communal funds. Why suddenly?
Right.
And the vort was exactly as Rabbi Ko said it.
Oh, beautiful.
There's an understanding that this call, this gathering, this whatever I'm trying to accomplish is very unique. I understand my people. I am the leader of my people, and therefore I'm going to extend myself. But you can't pass something like that. Yeshua can't just take Moshe's trumpets and utilize it.
The Dvar Torah I want to share, I'm a little hesitant, I confess, because I've shared it so many times, but I love it. And it shows us something about Moshe that you really can't see in any other way. Eila hadvarim asher diber Moshe. These are the Devarim. These are the words that Moshe spoke, and it comprises nearly the entire Sefer Devarim. Moshe, at the burning bush, one of his reasons for not wanting to accept Hashem's mission, he says, Bi Adoni lo ish Dvarim anochi. I am not a man of Dvarim. I have a speech impediment. I cannot speak. I cannot communicate well. And of course, Hashem rejects that argument. Hashem sends him to Paro, and Moshe grows into the Moshe that he is. But if you think about it, how many times do we see throughout the course of the story of the Chumash that Moshe has to address the people, and we don't see any hesitation or whatsoever, so that by the time we get to the end of Chumash, the very person who said, I'm not a man of Dvarim, Eila hadvarim asher diber Moshe. These are the Dvarim that Moshe spoke. And the message, of course, is that Hashem saw something in Moshe that he didn't see in himself. And he had the confidence in him that he would find it. And he did find it. And I love sharing this with Bar and Bat Mitzvah kids because the beginning of their Jewish adulthood, I really believe it. Kids are capable of anything. They really are. You put your mind to something, you really work at it, capable of anything. And I think it's really beautiful coming from Moshe because lo kam navi od k'Moshe. Moshe is considered somebody who is so unreachable, so unrelatable. But in a certain way, we see something very clear. He didn't think he had this quality, this talent. And by the end of the Chumash, Hashem shows him he does.
That's beautiful.
It is very, very beautiful. And it speaks to like the transformative power of having the achrayas. Like when you have the responsibility, you can do things that you didn't think you could do. It connects to a different idea, a related idea, that at the end of Parshas Miketz, when Binyamin is exposed for having Yosef plants the goblet on Binyamin, and it seems like the whole story is about to crumble on the brothers, and it's this crisis moment. So Yehuda at the end of the Parsha says, Manumar la Adoni, manidaber, manitztadak. What can I possibly say to you? And that's the end of the Parsha. But then Vayigash, which is the continuation of that very same moment, but it's a week later when we read it in Shul, Vayigash love Yehuda. Yehuda draws close, and he gives a beautiful, stirring soliloquy where he makes the case. You knew what happened to us and what happened to my father, and we came down and please, and it's this amazing speech. But just a moment earlier, Yehuda said, what could I possibly say? I'm speechless. How can I possibly address you? And how do you account for that jump? It's the sense that Yehuda is kind of stepping into that leadership and that achrayas. He takes responsibility, and he finds the words where there were no words.
Yeah. It's a great response to the notion of imposter syndrome. Moshe Rabbeinu felt he had imposter syndrome, and look what he did.
Fake it until you become it.
One of the greatest lines, somebody actually in our shul, I won't name names because I did not ask him permission to quote him, but he one time told me, he's an extremely successful individual who really climbed the ladder in corporate America, and he one time told me this line, I was never quite ready for the job I just got.
Beautiful. Shkaya.
Thank you all so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed. If you're interested in sponsoring a future episode, please reach out to one of us. And of course, please send us your feedback. Shabbat Shalom and Good Shabbos from the One Pasuk Podcast.